It is such a privilege to be here today. Thank you so much to everyone at the Callier Center for inviting me and for being here to recognize the honor that Larry's received. It's just a real privilege, and I appreciate all of you staying until the cleanup dinner comes. You'll hear a number of the themes reiterated today, so I thank all of my co-presenters for setting this up so nicely. Certainly, I couldn't have done this work without a number of collaborators. So principally, Matthew Rispoli is the primary person who has informed so much of the psycholinguistic theory that's used in the different measures, both of input and of children's productions. And Jan Folt has been a tremendous colleague of mine who's really helped me think about language change from a growth model or a growth perspective. And as you can see, we've had numerous students involved in the transcription. I thought language transcription of children's speech was an onerous task, and that was until I started transcribing parent input. And parents talk a lot more than young children, so we couldn't do it without all of them. So the way that I'm going to organize the talk today is first to review a number of findings from some work that we started in about 2007. And it has looked really at the grammatical properties of child-directed speech and how that has been facilitating children's sentence development in these very, very early years. So all the studies that I'm going to talk about today will focus on young, typically developing children's language. But as you heard this morning, we all feel very strongly that that serves as an important foundation for informing intervention work with children with SLI. Then I'll turn to talking about some work that we've been doing, evaluating a new language modeling strategy. We call it toy talk, kind of built on top of self-talk and parallel talk that we're so familiar with. And then finally, I'll conclude spending most of the time talking about the parent-implemented intervention study that we just completed using that particular strategy. So one of the things that you've heard lots about today is the tense and agreement morphemes that we're so familiar with. What I'd like to take a step back and think about is that this diverse set of forms that all encode tense and agreement in English sit on top of a diverse variety of sentence types. So when we think about the copula-being morphemes, for example, this is sitting on top of a subject-predicate relationship that doesn't have any kind of lexical verb in it. Or the sentences like he need food or the juice spill, those are childlike sentences that are marked in an adult-like way with the addition of verb affixes. And then similarly, as you just heard, kids have to understand how those tense and agreement morphemes interact with different kinds of syntactic contexts. So in questions and negation, those forms work very differently. So what we see is that this system of tense and agreement transforms a childlike platform sentence into the adult-like variety. Now, what's really important is thinking about how children actually develop this variety of sentence contexts to hang those tense and agreement morphemes onto. And so that's really the framework that I'll be working from. So as we started thinking or looking at the input as it relates to children's early grammatical development, one of the things that you really see when you look back historically at the early studies of input was that it was kind of a shotgun approach. We would look at many, many, many properties of maternal input and correlate them with different properties of children's grammatical outcomes. And when you look at so many input measures at different points of development and with multiple measures of outcome, the chances of finding correlations just by chance, a spurious correlation, is quite high. And so in some of the early input work, we had trouble replicating findings. And also the challenge was that the way we were looking at input and output relationships weren't necessarily theoretically motivated. There weren't predictions made a priori. So that was one of the methodological challenges. The other in some of the early work was that children were coming into these studies at different ages, at different developmental levels, and we weren't doing a really good job of controlling for children's time one developmental level as we looked at those input relationships. So certainly another of the important findings that we're understanding more and more is how children exert an effect on the kind of input they receive from their parents. And so as we move forward, we're thinking very carefully about how to manage and think about those kind of bidirectional influences. So what is the approach that we've taken in this work? Well, first, we're using linguistic theory to really form a priori predictions about how one single grammatical system would hang together. And so we started with tense and agreement because that is a hallmark area of deficit for children with specific language impairment. We've also been informed by psycholinguistic theory in designing our measures of input and output. And so diversity has played a big role in that. We've been very interested in trying to protect against the kinds of repetitious output that children produce, saying the same things kind of over and over again. We've also been trying to look at diverse kinds of input structures as well. We've also recognized the potential for children to exert different kinds of influences on their parents, and so we're trying to start children in our studies at roughly the same developmental level and at roughly the same developmental age as closely as we can. The next piece took a lot of time to really understand when this system was coming online so that we could time the investigations to the developmental period in which the system was kind of turning on, if you will. So we wanted to start our investigations at the point before tense and agreement was being used by young children, but at the point where it was about to start. The idea here being that we could be a little bit more certain that we would catch that point in time where input could exert its effect on the developmental growth. If the system has already started to come in, the child's knowledge may be driving more of what we see growing versus if we start where they're just about to start. And then the final piece that I would say characterizes the way we've approached this work is that even though we're focusing on young, typically developing children, the kinds of questions that we've been asking has always been guided by the clinical needs of children with language impairments and also clinical practices and keeping that in the forefront. A little bit about common methodology as we go through these studies. The studies I'll be sharing with you are primarily from data that is collected in this period from 21 to 30 months of age in typical development. The children come into this lab playroom setting once every 3 months. Some of the studies we have different amounts of data, but essentially we're gathering at least 60 minutes of conversational play-based language samples from the children. The studies are typically designed where the parents are interacting with the child alone in the playroom for the first 30 minutes, and so we use that 30-minute input sample for the parents. And then an examiner comes in and joins the dyad and kind of begins to shift a little bit the discourse so that we can create more opportunities for the tense and agreement, more themes for the different kinds of sentence structures. So we kind of call it a semi-structure examiner-led sort of play session, but that allows us to get a little bit more, push the children a little bit more, though we don't use any of the adult input in those second 30-minute sessions. And just the last little piece of organization here. My arrow isn't showing up very well there. But the work that I'm going to be presenting, I'm going to contextualize in Fay and Feinstack's 5-phase plan for effective research. And really where we are right now is we've been working our way through pre-trial sort of correlational studies that look at relationships between input in terms of parent grammatical properties and kids' output. We've worked our way through looking at the feasibility or whether or not this is a clinically viable strategy. We're into an early efficacy stage right now where we're trying to do kind of a low-cost evaluation of is this intervention worthy of moving on into more rigorous kinds of tests. And obviously the next phase, which we aren't anywhere close to, is asking that question about is this doable? Can this be effectively managed in real kinds of clinical contexts? But that's where we would like to go. The last little piece here is I always like to make my motivations really clear when I'm talking about input. So certainly I'm in part motivated by the need for effective early grammatical interventions because we know for children with SLI, Grammar is one of the most impacted areas of language acquisition for children with language impairments. In no way do I assume that input is the cause of the language problems these children are experiencing. But rather, our goal is to think about ways in which we can identify properties of grammatical input that can make learning easier. So in this way, what we're looking for are input properties that can moderate the expression of that language impairment. Okay? All right, so let's start with study one. This was one of our earliest pre-trial studies, and the basic question in this first study was, how are grammatical properties of parent input related to children's progress in the acquisition of tense and agreement? This study was inspired by a linguistic framework by Charles Young. As I mentioned this morning, in this framework, he viewed learning as a form of kind of competing probabilistic kinds of sources as well. Here, the idea is that input sentences can either be presented with positive or overt examples of tense and agreement, like Pooh Bear likes honey, or you could have an equally grammatical input sentence like I like honey, but the verb form is bear, because in English, there is no marking in first person sentences. And the idea being that children learning the world's languages, some are exposed to languages that are marked or have a tense parameter in them. Other languages like Mandarin don't have tense in them. And so children are having to sift through input data to say, which of these two possible types of language am I trying to learn? And then it would be the input sentences that would lead children through that hypothesis. One of the things I found very appealing about this particular framework was that it made quantitative predictions that would have something to do with the rate at which children would acquire this beginning or this move into tense and agreement. And the way in which Young and his colleagues were computing this was looking at the proportion of input sentences that were marked overtly, so they were unambiguous for tense, versus those that could lead the learner astray, the ambiguous kinds, like I like juice. We called this input informativeness to make it a little bit of a shorthand. And again, it was framed from a cross-linguistic perspective. And so what Young was saying was basically that in the world's languages, Spanish, being a much more morphologically rich language, had far more input sentences that overtly marked tense. And lo and behold, children learning Spanish acquire the tense and agreement system at a much younger age. French, a more marked language, but has a little bit more phonological opacity to it. Those children learn the system a little bit later. English being so sparse, children learn it late. Okay, so here's just a verb paradigm that will help you see some of these differences. So for the child learning English, if they hear a number of input sentences with a state verb like, I like, you like, they like, the verb form is always ambiguous. It's only when you get to third person singular that you would get overt evidence. Okay? If we contrast this with Spanish, the typology is very rich, and each and every verb form is marked. So it wouldn't matter what kinds of sentences the children are getting, they're going to more likely get overt evidence for tense in the language. Okay? And so the basic observation here was that children learning morphologically rich languages produce these kinds of sentences with some marking for tense and agreement at much younger ages. So what we became interested in was whether or not we could see variation in parents' input within a single language, within English. So we set out with this hypothesis. Is variation in parent input informativeness for tense within English, does that explain any variation in children's rate of acquisition the first time they start to produce these tense and agreement markers? Okay, and we wondered how much variability is there within parents. So what we did was we began to code all of the verb forms in the input into young children at 21 months of age, before children are using any of these tense and agreement morphemes. So at 21 months, we were coding the parent input samples, And we had already done growth modeling studies looking at individual differences in children's rate of tense and agreement productivity. So each of these lines, it's gone. So each of these lines represents a growth trajectory for individual children. And so what we were looking at was how the richness of the parents' input informativeness predicted the individual differences at 30 months of age. Okay? To give you a sense of this variable, here are some utterances, input sentences from a parent we would characterize as having low informativeness. So this is based on each verb form. So in this sentence, you have a copula form, so it's marked for plus tense. Here you have a question form, but it's still plus tense, marked in the language. Here's some interesting sentences from this mom. Want more? Want to put it together? We hear those all the time. These casual questions, it's very natural for us to drop not only the tense and agreement morpheme, but also the subject. Okay? You want help? So there the subject is provided, but the tense and agreement morpheme is still missing. There you go. Very formulaic, but exists in the input. Imperatives, push it up the hill, minus tense. We finally get to some past tense forms that are marked plus tense. So the computation is how many verb forms are negative or ambiguous compared to how many are positive. Okay? So that mother had 33% input informativeness, not very informative. Contrast this. This is an excerpt of utterances taken in sequential succession from our highest input parent. Notice how different the input is. This is a tow truck. Nope, tow truck doesn't work that well, does it? Elmo is being towed away. Okay, so what you see is in each of these sentences, you have a lot more obvious marking of tense. You see fewer questions too. Okay, so there's more commenting here. But essentially, we're getting a huge range of variation. What Young found in his study was that English had about 51% informativeness, and what we were showing is this range from 33 to 67%. Okay? So here's the empirical finding. What we found was that parent input informativeness at 21 months was indeed associated with children's 30-month tense agreement productivity scores. If we looked at the variance that was being accounted for, we were accounting for about 23% of the variance, even after controlling for the differences in children's expressive vocabulary at that point in time. So we thought this was pretty promising and that we should continue thinking about how these competing sources of verb forms were playing out. Now, the other thing that we learned while we were going through and doing all of this verb coding was how the parent's style of interaction was relating to the verb form. So I even showed you in those contrasts, the mom that had some low informativeness there had a lot of questions and was dropping a lot of those auxiliaries. The dad who was highly informative was doing a lot of descriptive talking. And so I started worrying about, well, how does this style variable interact with the kinds of verb forms that kids are receiving? And in particular, it seemed like our parents who were doing more descriptive talk were just in that place where they were providing a lot more plus tense forms. The other thing that was interesting, though, was that I was aware of some findings in the literature that said parents who are more directive have children whose grammatical development is slower, right? But that never really felt good to me because this is a style of communicating, but it was related to grammar. But where was the theory that would tie those two things together? And so this gave me a way of saying, okay, there's a correlation between how you interact and the kinds of data, the input data that you might be delivering. So that caused us to really kind of dig in and try and understand how directive styles brought in a different type of verb form. But the other thing I'll tell the clinicians in the room was that I knew about directiveness being kind of a no-no and we shouldn't be doing that. So how do we get kids to do things, right? We're more indirect. We say, let's build a tower, right? Well, in this scheme, the let would be a negative verb, negative tense. And the build is now also a negative tense. And I started worrying about if I'm super indirect, am I actually providing twice as much ambiguous input. Okay? And modals, that's our other way of being kind of gentle, right? Should we build a tower now? We're also indirect. And so I just kind of had to get a hold of this to figure out, are the kinds of things that we're doing to avoid being direct also providing not such great input to learn from? So the clinical relevance, of course, was if we could show that some of these styles were more or less related to the positive forms, that we might have another way into thinking about how to provide more abundant data for children to learn from. So actually this nagging question was taken up by Colleen Fitzgerald to do as a master's thesis, and I was thrilled that she was interested in following up on it. And so she started to code all of these parent input sentences for directive style versus a more descriptive style. And within directive styles, we looked for direct forms of guiding the child's attention or behavior. So put it here, don't do that. Now importantly, notice put it here is a minus tense verb form, but don't do that has the auxiliary marked there. So you can, they're both negative and plus tense forms. The indirect, let's build, versus a question, do you want to build a tower? So that has the auxiliary marked there. Descriptive styles, I started worrying about descriptive styles of self-talk and parallel talk, because when we just talk about I like your tower, we're providing negative tense information. But the other focused kind of descriptive style, where we're talking about the objects in the environment instead of what we're doing or what the child is doing, are most often carrying these kinds of plus tense information. And so our hypothesis was that a descriptive other focused style would be associated with higher levels of informativeness for tense. So why would that be the case? Well, this just kind of lays out the different sorts of verb forms as a function of the language typology. What you can see here in the top is that with these kinds of state verbs, they're all ambiguous for tense, but when we get down to the other focused in the third person singular self, we're carrying that tense morpheme. Now, in the case of copula and auxiliary, all of those kinds of descriptive sentences like I'm hungry or I'm eating or the cow is hungry, they're all marked. But essentially what we're saying is that in that third person self, that's where it's carrying the richest information. Okay? A second thing that we knew about was that when we're coding these parents' input, when parents are interacting with young children who don't talk a lot, they're asking a lot of questions about what the child wants to do. Okay? So you want juice, you want more, you need help. And so what was very obvious to us when we coded all of these is that when the subject was second person you, a lot of the times the parents were dropping the tense and agreement morpheme altogether. In fact, our studies have shown they're dropping it about 45% of the time. But if the subject was third person, like Pooh Bear or the cows, they rarely dropped it, right? So, Pooh want more juice? Would you say that when you're interacting with a child? You'd say, does Pooh Bear want more juice? So that was the other reason that we thought that the other focused might in fact be more associated with informativeness. So what did Fitzgerald find? She did indeed find a negative association with directed discourse, so the imperatives. She found a positive association, as we predicted, for other focused discourse. And lucky for us, we have no association whatsoever with the indirect sort of style. So we can continue to use our modals, and we can continue to use our let's build. But so the hypothesis was supported. And this got us started, this got us to thinking about, okay, so if this other focused descriptive style of commenting is more associated with more abundant data, can we actually shift people towards using that other focused style of descriptive commenting? So the next question, now we're kind of moving into feasibility. Is this a clinically viable strategy? Is it possible to increase adults' use of those other focused descriptive kinds of comments? And importantly, we want to know if we could do that, could we get a change in the verb forms for free? Without having to tell them anything about tense and agreement morphemes, could we enrich the input? So this was another thesis project that Katie Walsh took on with me. And we started calling this strategy toy talk. Again, building off of the familiar self-talk, parallel talk, toy talk. Okay? But you can use it with many things other than just toys. So what is it? It's a language modeling strategy, and it's similar to self-talk and parallel talk that we've either learned about in our classes or taught for years and years. So it's similar in the ways that it's just descriptive commenting. Okay? Matching the content of the language input to children's interests, to activities, what they're focused on. How is it different? It's simply different in that we are promoting descriptive talk about the objects in the environment. Okay? So instead of talking about what I'm doing or what the child is doing, I'm talking about what the child is doing with the toys. Okay? All right, so when we teach this, we don't teach anything about grammar. We just teach two strategies. Talk about the toys. So we talk about, characterizing the states, the actions, the properties of the toys. And that's designed, okay, so what I know in my head is that if I say talk about the toys, what I'm actually doing is increasing the frequency of the third person subjects in the input. Okay? So instead of you found a pig, right? The child reaches, grabs a puzzle piece, you say you found a pig. Instead, you can start to talk about the pig. So the pig goes here, the pig fits here. Oh, I'm sorry, he fits. This is the first one. So you're building a castle. Instead of talking about the child's action, we can talk about the action of the tower. It's wobbly. You like juice? We can talk about the property of the juice. It's yummy. Okay? So this is just the first one. So if you just talk about the toys, you could end up with pronominal subjects. Okay? But when we add the second strategy, give the item its name. Now we're shifting he fits here into something more like the pig fits here. Right? It's wobbling becomes the castle is wobbling. It's yummy. The juice is yummy. All right, so what's happening as we push those lexical noun phrases into the input? We're increasing the variability. We're increasing the diversity of those subject types. Okay, so again, it's very much like what we're doing in our naturalistic language facilitation techniques. This is just an example of real discourse that came out of a clinician-child interaction. So the clinician asks, where should I put this block? The child responds, on castle. The clinician takes that word, put the block on the castle, kind of clarifying. The castle is wobbling. Okay, so she's used the word castle that the child has. She's describing the castle. She uses it again. The castle fell over. The child has something unintelligible and then says, the castle fell. Okay. So what we're trying to do is take the vocabulary items the child has, and instead of letting them stay kind of in that object position, we're trying to promote them up to the subject position. Okay? So why might this work? Well, from a linguistic rationale, we think that it's going to increase the input informativeness. Because again, the third person cell is the most consistently marked. Oh. So what do we do first to kind of just try this out? Well, instead of trying it out with real children and real families, we tried it out with college students. So what we did was we videotaped parents interacting with their toddlers. We created a videotape of these play scenarios, and then we turned it into a silent video. And we asked the college students to come in and talk for the parent. We had no idea if this would work, but it was so interesting because they were, they were encouraging the kids and, scolding them not to touch things. So they just talked like you would talk to children. And we showed them the video first, and then what we provided was 20 minutes of instruction on these toy talk strategies. So we talked about the toys, give the item its name. We did a little demonstration, let them practice a little bit, gave them some feedback, and then we showed them the exact same videotape and had them talk to the parent again. Okay? So here's what we got. This was the change in the college students' use of lexical NPs as subjects. Huge effect. Okay? We also got a significant effect on the form of the verbs that they were using. and we shifted that input informativeness closer to a mean of about 60%, which was considerably more than what we had seen in our other studies. Okay, so we thought, all right, this might actually work. Let's see what happens when we try it with parents. And that's where we are right now, is that we've just finished running the first group of parents. Again, these are typically developing kids. But now what we're trying to do is see if we can teach these strategies to parents, if parents can learn them. And the question being, can we use this toy talk instruction to increase the frequency and the diversity, the variability of those subjects in parent input to toddlers? And if we can, does this have an impact on the kinds of sentences that the children are producing? And if so, what about the children's tense and agreement morphemes? Okay. So now I'm going to move back into the psycholinguistic rationale for it. Why would we think that these lexical noun phrases would be so important here? Well, the idea is that those lexical noun phrases and having lots of diversity in that position will help us to identify the subject position more easily. Okay? Why is that? Again, this is drawn from the statistical learning literature, so I appreciate being set up here. Lexical noun phrases like the pig or your tower are lower in frequency compared to those closed class pronominal subjects like it or that or you. Therefore, the transitional probabilities between the words are going to be much lower. And so the child should hypothesize that these are distinct or separate constituents. And that making that constituent boundary easier to identify should help really strengthen that subject-predicate relationship for the child. Okay, so that's the logic here. In addition, the presence of those lexical noun phrases are hypothesized to make the tense and agreement morphemes more salient to the child as well. Why is this? Well, because from adult psycholinguistics, what we know is that sentences with longer and lower frequency noun phrases are more likely to have full or uncontracted copulas and auxiliaries than those with pronominal subjects. So what's the background there? This was a really new idea for me too. But the idea is that when we're using pronouns, we're assuming that the speaker already understands the referent, right? And so information is shared, and so we can kind of push it through faster. But if that subject is longer or is new, we're going to slow down the information flow because we aren't assuming that the speaker knows what we're talking about. Okay, so one of the things that we're really interested in is if we can get parents to use these lexical noun phrase subjects, do we get them to present more acoustically salient grammatical input also that might help the children? Okay, so also then the idea being if they have these forms delivered as full or uncontracted forms, it might also help them learn those as distinct constituents and not as a rote chunk. Okay, does that all make sense? All right, so what's the design? We recruit kids at about 20 months of age and are trying to get these children at the point where they have at least 25 words but aren't really producing sentences frequently. Then we run the intervention with the parents between the 21 and 24 month measurement points. We have a group session, I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment, followed by 2 individualized coaching sessions. So all of that happens in that 3-month period. At 24 months, what we're hoping to see is just that we get a change in the parent input. Okay? We wouldn't really expect to see much change in the children's sentence diversity until about 27 months of age. That's what we were hoping for. And that potentially we might be able to see a change in the children's tense and agreement morphemes by 30 months. So that's kind of the basic design. So in this particular study, the parents are all English-only speakers, and the same parent was required to attend all of the parent education sessions and be present for all of those measurement sessions as well. With some of our families, we had spouses also come to the parent education session, but we only let one parent interact with the children when we were collecting the data. The children were all typically developing, but we designed it so that they were in the slow half. So basically these were kids who were not yet or rarely producing sentences. At 20 months, if any parent told me that they could ever put 4 words together, they were excluded immediately. Some of the kids were producing 3-word sentences, but during the phone interview, I would ask the parents for examples of those 3 words, and so long as I only got 3 words together that weren't necessarily sentence-like or were only I sentences where the subject was I, then we allowed them to come in. They all had to pass the communication section of the Ages and Stages questionnaire, and then as an early efficacy study, we were able to match these kids to children from our previous studies. And so we have a quasi-control group that's not randomly assigned, but this seemed like a good first way to just kind of look at the early efficacy of this approach. So here are characteristics of the treatment group. We have 19 in each of these groups. We have 17 moms and 2 dads in our treatment group. You'll notice that they're older than a lot of parents are, and certainly there's a bit of a sampling bias here in that the parents who volunteered to participate in something that was going to take over 9 months, they were older and somewhat more educated. And they were all white, upper middle class to middle class families. But as you can see in the children's data, these are kids whose MLUs are 1.23 at the beginning. They're producing about 25 different words just at the very beginning of combining, and they're very well matched to the kids that we had from the quasi-control group. Okay, so what about this parent education? It's pretty minimal, really. We spend an hour and a half with the parents, and in that first group hour-and-a-half session, we simply talked about language development in this early period, so gave them some information about language milestones from 18 to 30 months of age. We also talked about general responsive kinds of intervention strategies, and the toy talk portion where we taught them those strategies across all of our group sessions was only about 25, 26 minutes long. Okay? Then when they came back for the 2 individualized coaching sessions, these usually happen 2 or 3 weeks after the group instruction, and we spaced them by about 2 to 3 weeks in time. And they were an hour in length. So altogether, the parents were only getting 3.5 total hours, of which not all of that time was focused on the strategies. So this just kind of gives you a framework for the foundation of that interaction. We modeled it off of the Hannon program material, so, and actually we gave them the You Make the Difference book, which is just for typically developing kids. So certainly they were introduced to responsive strategies of observing and waiting and listening. We spent a lot of time on joining in the play, because to be able to provide the language input, you've got to be able to join in. One of the things I'll tell you we learned was that to provide a lot of different lexical verbs, you have got to get parents to actually engage in the play. So one of my parents said, I can say the toy is, but I can't really use those verbs. And when we started watching her, she wasn't doing any kinds of actions. So we started doing a lot more with helping parents learn to join in, because as they were engaged in the actions, the verbs came much more easily. So that was something I learned. We also did interaction promoting kinds of things, expanding here being the biggest thing that we focused on. For the kids we had some kids who came in who were very unintelligible, so with them we used a lot more of interpreting and imitating. But for the kids who were single word producers, we really were focusing a lot on the expanding part. We did talk about ways to highlight language. Especially, we focused on slowing some of the parents down, because when kids aren't talking a lot, the parents want to fill the silence. And we talked a lot about just generally commenting. We didn't tell parents not to use self-talk or parallel talk. We were trying to just be positive about what are things that you can do, rather than ever saying, don't do this. Okay? And then on top of all of that was where these 2 little strategies came. So we developed a handout that they took home with them in a folder. So of course they did have access to that after the instruction. We went over that handout. We provided them with demonstrations of 2 clinicians, one being the adult and one acting as though they were the child. And we did role play with the parents as well. When they came for the coaching sessions, we discussed the strategy use and how it was going at home. We focused a little bit on the 3A ways, so using those responsive intervention strategies, but then also the toy talk. And it helped us to understand how well they could talk and explain those strategies. So we did some of that interviewing in the first 10 minutes. Then we had them play with their child for 10 minutes, and we video recorded that. And then we spent the remainder of that coaching session playing back the 10 minutes of video, stopping it approximately once every minute, or with a key moment to kind of point out, here's where you did a really nice job of. As they got more comfortable, we would try to ask them about, to see if they could self-identify things. And then we emailed follow-up information about the kinds of things, the suggestions that we had given them. So again, they did have access to that information outside of our sessions. So what about the measures that we use to look at change? We were very, very strict in what we coded as toy talk in the parent's input. So the parent input, to be coded as a toy talk utterance, had to have an explicit subject, and it had to have an explicit predicate. It had to appear in a canonical SVO word order. So we didn't code anything that was a question as toy talk. Okay? It had to have a third-person subject, and that third-person subject had to be a referent that was physically present in the play environment. So if they talked about daddy and he wasn't in the room, that we weren't coding as toy talk either. So think about this kind of toy talk as a highly contextualized form of sort of literate language use. Okay? Then we subdivided those kinds of utterances into toy talk with a pronoun, so it's hot or he's running, versus toy talk with a lexical noun phrase subject. So the egg is hot versus the horse is running. And that allowed us to look at the frequency of these kinds of input sentences as well as their diversity. We also have descriptive measures, so standard things like total utterances, MLU, and a number of different words. And then we were also interested in labeling, because labeling is so common. And also because if parents only picked up on the strategy of give the item its name, we could have changed labeling a lot, right? And so these had the structure of a pronoun subject, a copula, and then the noun phrase. All right, so let's give a little bit of a feel for what these parents were doing. This is a post-instruction video, and let's just kind of look at the transcript first, and then I'll play it for you. So the things I want you to notice is that the child at this point is leading the interaction. Right? The child starts out with the word hot here, and so the parent is expanding the word hot and is also using a toy talk strategy. Now the first time she says, oh, it is hot. Okay, so that's toy talk pronoun. Parents did this a lot, and we would all do that, right? It's very natural to use the pronoun. That's how English works. If we know what the referent is, we refer to it with a pronoun. And we said, that's just fine, that's so natural. But on the next time you have the opportunity, then maybe try to use the lexical noun. So here's an example of how he then makes another comment about this egg, and he says up there. And this time she says the egg is on top. Okay, so we always tried to say, this is how language works, go with the way language works, just try to do this once or twice a minute. Okay, so it wasn't try to do it all the time.
Oh, it is hot. The egg is on top.
Simple? All right, so this is a sample of all of the lexical NP subjects that that mother used at 24 months. And what I've underlined, each one of the underlines is a different lexical NP subject. Okay? This is a remarkable amount of diversity compared to what we see in 21 months without any of this kind of intervention or instruction. The other thing I want you to notice is how many of these are common nouns. So we have bear, the penguin, this plate, the egg, the man, the door. She can do this with a range of lexical NPs. Not all of the parents could use so many different common nouns. They would latch on to poo and the baby and use those over and over again. but diversity matters. Okay. All right, so let's move on and look at, okay, so question, does toy talk instruction increase the lexical subjects in parent input? Here are our time by condition interactions. So the intervention group is in green, the control group, quasi-control group is in blue. You can see they're very similar at the beginning. And the key over here is in frequency from 0 to 60. So you can think about that as how often per minute, if you will. Okay, so we had, as an average for our intervention group, about 40 of these lexical noun phrases in 60 minutes, if you will. Okay. This graph is showing us the lexical NP types. So the intervention group here is going from about 6 pre-intervention to about 18. Okay, so that's a 3 times the increase in the number of different lexical NP subjects. This graph is just showing you the individual variability. So the last figure showed you mean differences. This shows you how much variability there was among our parents in the group. So the means certainly are changing here. Okay, you can see the mean changes and the median, but we have huge variation in how well the parents learn the strategies. What's also interesting to me is that the results were very specific to the lexical NPs. So if we look at labeling, we get no significant differences whatsoever. It wasn't labeling that was changing, and it wasn't really the toy talk pronouns that were changing. If parents are using these kinds of descriptive input sentences, they tend to be with pronouns, and that didn't change with the intervention. So I think we have some nice data that says the intervention was specific to those lexical NPs. We do get some time changes in terms of parent MLU and a number of different words. So regardless of which group you're in, as children get older and their utterances and their number of words increase, the parents are also changing their utterance length and the number of different words they're producing. But there's no intervention effect there. So what about the kids? So for the kids, we want to know if toy talk instruction accelerated their sentence diversity. And so here, we're focusing explicitly on those third-person kinds of sentence contexts. So just a little bit on the measure that we use. We're looking at combinations of unique grammatical subjects with lexical verbs. Okay, so here, it, fall, and it, egg, they have different, it, fall, and egg, fall have different subjects, so they would count as 2 different. It, fall, and it, go have different lexical verbs, and it, go, and they, going, they are different subjects, so this would be a total of 5 different unique subject-verb combinations. Does that make sense? So I'm going to show you this little guy and kind of the beginnings of his creation of these kinds of utterances. This is the same mother and child. And just to set them up again, here's the one you saw.
It is hot. The egg is on top.
So she's talking about the egg here. About 6 minutes later, the egg's going to come up again.
Let's cook the egg. Should we use the skillet or a bowl?
Choice question.
I'm putting a spoon to use. Did the egg fall down? The egg fell.
Okay, so she said egg fall, and he imitates that spontaneously, right? Now, about 6 minutes, they talk about other things in between, but I thought it was interesting to see how this kind of takes place. So in this last clip, he's on his own.
Is the egg all done? Close the door. The egg fell down.
And I don't know if anybody could hear that, but did anybody hear the beginnings of a little article in there? The egg, I mean, it's not really a clear the. Right, but I would never in a million years expected that you'd start to hear that. But, so I think he had 2 sentences like that at 24 months. I mean, this is rare, okay? But that's the idea, that what we're trying to do is get parents to be responsive to the words that kids are using, to take the words that they're using, and to promote them into that subject position. And she is doing a beautiful job of that. Okay, so in our studies, we look at growth models that take a look at how this variable changes over time. This is the quadratic effect for all of the kids across both groups together. And what we're seeing is that at 27 months of age, where these are centered, the kids are producing 5 or 6 of these on average at that point in time, and they're increasing by about 1 to 2 of those kinds of sentences per month. This is the individual data for the kids, and in this slide, the treatment group is in blue, the control group is in gray. And one of the things that I just want to point out is you can kind of see 3 bands. These are the kids that weren't quite ready for sentences yet. There's this group that kind of has a slower start and then starts to increase. And then the group that maybe the intervention was really timed very well to. But what's of primary interest to us is the group effect in how group interacts with these growth trajectories. So here is the group by condition effect, or the condition effect for the quadratic trend. And what we're finding is that we don't have group differences in terms of how many of those kinds of sentences the kids are producing at 27 months, but what we do have is a shift, a significant shift in the acceleration of those kinds of sentences. And in fact, the acceleration is about 3 times as great for the kids who are in that intervention group. So that makes us hopeful. What's also interesting was we went back to say, well, the parents are very, very different in how much of this they are providing to their children. So how does the parents' diversity of those subjects relate to the kids' individual growth trajectories? And so here we looked at the diversity, not the frequency. And the diversity of those lexical NPs was a significant linear predictor of the linear growth at 27 months. So that means the line tangent to those curves at 27, and of the acceleration from 21 to 30 months of age. And here's the, in addition, this is controlling for how much the parents talked at 21 months and how many different words the kids used at 21, at 24, at 27, and at 30 months. So that's really exciting to me because what we're saying is that given control over their expressive vocabulary, we're showing these differences that are related to the ways in which parents are using the lexical NPs in that position. Okay, what about kids? I'll try and finish this up quickly. Kids in tense and agreement, we do the same sort of thing in looking at unique combinations. And so we only look at instances where kids are combining the verb inflections with unique lexical verbs or copulas and auxiliaries with unique subject forms. Okay, so our measure is this tense agreement productivity score, and it reduces a lot of that repetitious kind of child language. And this is just a graph of the kinds of acceleration that we're seeing in the children's acquisition of tense and agreement morphemes. And again, what you see is that major change in acceleration. We get some of that still after controlling for the sentence diversity. Now, what's exciting to me about this is that we've said absolutely nothing about tense and agreement morphemes, right? The parents have learned, talk about the toys and give the items its name. They're talking more about third-person subjects, and with it, we're getting some benefit without ever having to talk about the little structure. Now, what's changing in the parents' tense and agreement? It's not the input informativeness. And I'm not terribly surprised because we've never loved coding this because we don't think that all instances of copula in particular are created equal. So especially those its and that's and your, we don't really like those because they're these rote chunks in the input. So we've been actually looking at the way the input is packaged, especially at this declarative structure, X is Y, with the full uncontracted forms. We've focused a lot on copula because it's the most prevalent in the input, and we're getting major changes in how parents package those morphemes as well. So here's that mom again, and what I tried to do this time was bold her is's. And what's really amazing to me here is that every single time she says is, it was a contractible context, right? She could have said, bears on the chair, penguins up here. She could have, but she didn't. So that's really interesting to me. So in summary, what we've been looking at is how parent input changes the child sentence diversity and how the child sentence diversity is pushing the acquisition of these tense and agreement morphemes. We've been able to increase the parents' frequency and diversity of those lexical NP subjects, that this is accelerating the kids' acquisition of the sentence diversity, that the lexical NP types is actually predicting some of this individual change in the kids, and we're starting to see this benefit on acquisition of the tense and agreement morphemes. Now, of course, this is relative to kids in a quasi-control group. We haven't had a real test of this with random assignment. And one of the things, of course, I'm concerned about is that our groups were not really well balanced on parent education and on race ethnicity and those sorts of things. I guess another important thing that I think we have to really unpack still is how these parent interaction styles are interacting with this. So one of the things that was very difficult for me was that when the parents came in and didn't have the kinds of play and responsivity that I wanted to see as a clinician, it influenced the amount of time that we actually spent on toy talk. So one of the things that I think we could certainly do as we move forward is think about how to have a two-stage sort of intervention where we wait to have those things in place before we would start that kind of intervention. Yeah. So certainly, on the downside, we aren't seeing intercept differences, so the groups aren't actually different in the actual scores at this point. Had we followed them longer, maybe we would see that. But on the upside of that, I think we have to go back and remember how brief this intervention is. We're talking about 3.5 hours, and not all of it was on this diversity. Okay, so we can certainly increase that. And certainly the kids varied a lot on their readiness. So I think if we waited and started to look for readiness indicators before we would do this kind of intervention, we would perhaps have a bigger intervention effect and see the change. I think. Oh, so it's feasible, we see growth, and clinical populations, and really thinking about how to move this forward is the next step. So I know I'm almost out of time. Thank you so much.